On the morning of February 14th, 1,943 12 Marine pilots climbed into the cockpits of an airplane their own Navy didn't trust enough to fly from its carriers. They had been on Guadalcanal for 2 days. There was no manual for what they were about to do because no American pilot had ever done it. No one had ever taken an F4U Corsair into combat against the aircraft that had swept every Allied fighter from the Pacific sky since the first weeks of the war. 42 Zeros fell on them 10 minutes from the target. When the smoke cleared, 9 Allied aircraft were gone. The Japanese lost one. The men who flew back to Guadalcanal that afternoon did not land believing they had just witnessed the future of naval aviation. They landed having watched 2 of their own die in an airplane that had just failed its first test in the worst possible way. What none of them could have known was that this defeat was not the end of anything. It was the opening line of one of the most complete reversals in the history of aerial warfare. A reversal that would take 11 months to strip Japan's naval air force of everything it had once believed about its own invincibility, and transform a machine that had just been humiliated over Bougainville into the aircraft Japanese pilots feared most in the Pacific sky. The Japanese pilots who had dominated the Pacific Air Wars since December of 1941 had good reason to believe that nothing the Americans could put into the air would change the equation. Their machine was the Mitsubishi A6M Zero, and for 2 years it had been exactly what its designers promised: an aircraft of almost supernatural lightness, capable of outturning any Allied fighter in the Pacific, climbing faster than anything it fought, dancing through a dogfight with a responsiveness that pilots described less as flying and more as thought made physical. A man who had spent years in its cockpit did not feel he was wrestling a machine into compliance. He felt the machine seemed extending his intentions into the air around him. The Zero had arrived in combat in China in 9,940, and its first encounters with Chinese Air Force fighters had been so lopsided as to seem almost beyond belief. Reports from those early engagements filtered back through Allied intelligence channels and were received with considerable skepticism. Aircraft did not perform the way the combat reports described. The turn rates were impossible, the climb rates were fabricated, the kill ratios were propaganda. American and British air officers read the intelligence summaries and adjusted the numbers downward by whatever margins seemed appropriate to bring them back inside the realm of the plausible. They were wrong to do so. The training pipeline that produced the men who flew the Zero was built on the same philosophy of excellence at any cost that had produced the aircraft itself. Most candidates who entered it never earned their wings. The selection process was brutal and unapologetic, designed to identify the rare individual whose coordination, spatial reasoning, and physical tolerance matched the specific demands of carrier aviation at the highest level, and to eliminate everyone else as quickly as possible. The ones who survived the selection received years of progressively more demanding instruction before they were considered ready for combat assignment. By early 1943, that doctrine had never been seriously tested at scale. There had been no reason to test it. From Pearl Harbor to the Philippines to the waters off Ceylon, Allied fighters had fallen out of the Pacific sky in numbers that seemed almost impossible to the men who watched them go. The Zero had done that. The men who flew it had done that. And as February of 1943 opened over the steaming jungle airstrips of Guadalcanal, there was no particular reason for the Japanese pilots based at Rabaul, 300 miles to the northwest, to believe that a new American fighter with a peculiarly bent wing was going to change any of it. 6,000 miles away in a factory in Stratford, Connecticut, belonging to the Chance Vought Corporation, a very different set of problems had produced a very different airplane. The F4U Corsair had not been designed to be beautiful. It had not been designed to outturn a Zero or to feel like thought made physical to the men who flew it. It had been designed around an engine, the largest, most powerful aircraft engine then available from an American manufacturer, and the propeller that engine demanded. The Pratt & Whitney R2 1800 double wasp produced roughly 2,000 horsepower. At the time the Corsair's design was finalized, that represented nearly double the output of anything Japan had fielded in a single seat. To extract the full potential of that engine required the largest propeller yet fitted to a single-engine production aircraft, a 13-foot, 4-inch diameter blade that at full power generated torque forces capable of rolling the whole machine if a pilot was not careful on the throttle during takeoff. Fitting that propeller without building absurdly long landing gear long enough to keep the blade tips clear of the runway required engineering creativity that showed in the aircraft's most distinctive feature. The designers bent the wings downward near the fuselage in an inverted gull shape, allowing the landing gear to be shortened by keeping the attachment point at the lowest part of the wing curve while still clearing the ground. It It was an elegant solution to an unusual problem, and it gave the aircraft its unmistakable silhouette and eventually its nickname among the men who flew it. They called it the bent-wing bird or the bent-wing bastard, depending on the day and whether anyone senior was listening. It was fast. In level flight, it could reach speeds that no Zero could match without tearing itself apart in the attempt. It could outdive anything in the Pacific theater and hold together doing it, thanks to a stressed metal skin and full cylinders wrapped in self-sealing rubber that could absorb hits, which would have turned a Zero into a fireball. Over 200 pounds of armor plate protected the pilot and the oil systems behind him protection. The featherweight Japanese fighter did not carry because the Japanese engineers had made a deliberate choice to trade survival against damage for range and maneuverabilities. 6 Browning 50 caliber machine guns filled the wings, each capable of firing at a rate that could put a lethal burst into a target in the fraction of a second available during a high-speed pass. None of that mattered to the United States Navy. Carrier trials had exposed 2 problems that Navy admirals could not overlook. The long nose blocked the pilot's view of the flight deck during a landing approach, forcing pilots to weave from side to side just to see where they were going. The main landing gear was too stiff, causing the aircraft to bounce violently on touchdown, sometimes hard enough to launch it back into the air with no control, directly toward the parked aircraft waiting ahead on the deck. A bounced landing on a carrier was not merely dangerous to the pilot, it was dangerous to everyone on the flight deck and potentially to the carrier itself. In a war being fought from fleet carriers that could not afford to be damaged by their own aircraft, the Navy made a decision that seemed entirely reasonable at the time. It handed its newest, most powerful fighter to the Marine Corps and told the Marines to fly it from land. That decision put the Corsair in the hands of Marine Fighting Squadron 124, and it put Marine Fighting Squadron 124 on Guadalcanal by the second week of February, 1,943 2 days before their first combat mission. The squadron's commanding officer was Major William Guise. He had little time to develop tactics for an airplane. His pilots barely knew because no such tactics existed. There was no manual for fighting Zeros in a Corsair because no one had ever done it. There was only the accumulated experience of every Allied pilot who had already tried to dogfight a Zero in a Wildcat or a P-40, and the lessons those pilots had brought back when they came back at all about exactly how badly that tended to go. The pilots who had survived that kind of encounter had come home with something more useful than a victory. They had come home with a specific, detailed knowledge of how the Zero behaved and what it could not do. It could not sustain speed dives without risk of structural failure. It could not absorb damage and keep flying. It could not match the horsepower advantage of a heavier American aircraft at altitude. And its pilots, however skilled, were operating at the end of a long supply line and a longer training pipeline with no replacement reserve that matched the depth of what was building in the American system. None of those advantages had translated into results yet, but they were there, waiting for a pilot smart enough to use them. On the morning of February 14th, GEs led 12 Corsairs into the air as part of a mixed escort force, protecting 9 PB-4Y Liberator bombers on a raid against the Japanese airfield at Kahili on the southern tip of Bougainville. 10 P-38 Lightnings from the Army Air Force's 339th Fighter Squadron flew alongside them, with a handful of P-40s assigned to cover the withdrawal. On paper, it was a formidable escort for a single bombing mission. Below them, as the formation climbed out over the channel, the sailors had already taken to calling Iron Bottom Sound, Stolzlosin Sound. The rusting outlines of hulls sunk in the naval battles of the previous autumn lay visible from altitude, a reminder written in corroded steel of exactly how much this stretch of ocean had already cost both sides. Inside the Corsair cockpits, the engines droned with an unfamiliar rhythm the pilots had not yet learned to trust. The long snout of the aircraft stretched out ahead of each man and blocked the horizon in a way no previous American fighter had. Most of the men behind those noses were experiencing combat for the first time in an airplane they had flown for a matter of days, flying toward a target protected by pilots who had been doing this for years. 10 minutes before the bombers reached Kahili, Japanese radar and coast watchers gave Rabaul enough warning to scramble a large interception force. 42 Zero fighters rose to meet the incoming Americans, diving out of high altitude with the sun at their backs, the classic attack posture that Japanese pilots had used to devastating effect since the war's opening weeks. They came down fast, picking targets in the escort formation before the Americans had fully processed what was happening. And the battle that followed was not a sustained, organized engagement. It was a melee. First Lieutenant Gordon Lyon went down when his aircraft collided with a Zero in the chaos of the dogfight. Both pilots died in the wreckage that fell toward the jungle below. First Lieutenant Harold Stewart went down in the same fight. Elsewhere in the formation, P-38s and P-40s fell, and 2 of the Liberator bombers the entire mission had been sent to protect were destroyed. When the surviving aircraft reached their bases that afternoon, the accounting was simple and brutal. 9 Allied aircraft destroyed, 1 Japanese fighter lost. The exchange ratio that had defined 2 years of air war over the Pacific, with Allied aircraft on the wrong end of it, had held exactly as it always had. The pilots who walked away from their aircraft that evening did not do so believing the Corsair had just unveiled itself as a war-winning weapon. They did so having watched 2 of their own die in a machine that was supposed to change everything against an enemy who had lost almost nothing in return. Back at the airstrip that night, ground crews walked the flight line in the tropical dark, counting empty parking spots where Corsairs should have stood, running their hands along bent-wing survivors in the fading light, checking for damage with the quiet, methodical care of men who had already learned not to ask too many questions about the pilots who were not coming back. The same airplane that had just failed so catastrophically possessed advantages that had nothing to do with tight turns or graceful maneuvering. Its engine alone produced more raw power than anything the Japanese had fielded in a single seat. Its airframe could absorb punishment that would have torn a Zero apart. Its guns threw a weight of fire that dwarfed what most Japanese fighters carried into battle. None of it had mattered on February 14th because the pilots flying it had tried to beat the Zero at its own game. What Major Gies and his surviving pilots did not yet know, walking away from their aircraft under the fading Pacific light, was that the lesson buried inside their defeat would become the foundation of an entirely new way of fighting the war in the air. To understand why February 14th mattered beyond the obvious fact of its losses, you need to understand the ground. Guadalcanal sits at the southern end of a chain of islands running northwest through the Solomon Islands toward the Japanese stronghold at Rabaul on the northeastern tip of New Britain. The island itself is roughly 90 miles long and 30 miles wide, covered in jungle so dense that the men fighting through it frequently lost track of direction within yards of leaving a trail. Rivers ran brown and fast off the central mountains and flooded without warning. The insects were endemic and the diseases they carried were not. By February of 1943, the Army and Marine forces who had been fighting over the island since the previous August had lost men to malaria and dysentery in numbers that competed seriously with combat casualties. But they held the airfield. Henderson Field, carved out of jungle by Japanese construction crews the previous summer and seized by Marines in August, before it was finished, repaired and extended under fire, and completed under continued Japanese attack, had become the strategic pivot of the entire South Pacific campaign. Whoever held that runway controlled the air over the Central and Lower Solomons, and whoever controlled the air over the Solomons controlled what could move through the waters below. Between those islands runs a long channel of open water that sailors and aviators on both sides had taken to calling the slot, a natural highway through which Japanese destroyers had been running supplies and reinforcements south under cover of darkness since the opening weeks of the Guadalcanal campaign. The same channel through which American supply convoys moved in the other direction, and through which the naval battles of the previous autumn had sent enough steel to the bottom that the waters off Guadalcanal now carried a name that required no explanation to anyone who had served in the theater: Iron Bottom Sound. The geography of the slot shaped every air battle fought above it. Aircraft operating from Guadalcanal and the airfields, the Marines and Army engineers were steadily pushing northwest through the chain, flew missions of fixed length toward targets of fixed location. Of an approach, the altitude ceilings were constrained by fuel calculations and by the practical limits of what pilots could sustain over the distance involved. Japanese fighters rising from Rabaul or from the fields at Kahili and Buin at Bougainville's southern tip knew the corridors the Americans would use, knew the altitudes they would fly, and had been using that knowledge to set up the kind of interceptions that had gone so badly for the escorting fighters over Bougainville on Valentine's Day. Rabaul itself was something that no single word adequately described. A harbor enclosed by the remains of a volcanic caldera, deep enough and sheltered enough to anchor a fleet, ringed by heights that made it defensible from the sea. The approach from the water led through a channel flanked by terrain that gave the defender every advantage: anti-aircraft guns, positioned to cover the water approaches, fighter strips positioned to cover the air approaches, the whole arrangement mutually reinforcing in a way that made a frontal assault from the sea look like something that would succeed only in producing enormous casualties. Japan had moved into Rabaul in January of 1942 and spent the subsequent year turning it into the most heavily defended base in the South Pacific 5 airfields. A garrison that would eventually number in the hundreds of thousands, underground facilities blasted into the volcanic rock that could survive almost any aerial bombardment, and, most importantly, a concentration of experienced naval aviators that represented the last significant reserve of trained Japanese air power in the theater. The pilots based at Rabaul and its satellite fields were not the products of the compressed wartime training pipelines that were beginning to graduate men in Japan by 1943 with a fraction of the pre-war flight hours. They were the survivors of 2 years of combat men who had flown from Pearl Harbor, from Midway, from the long attritional battles over Guadalcanal. Men who still carried the instinctive, accumulated feel of thousands of hours in the air and who had spent those hours doing exactly what the pilots of VMF 124 had tried to do on February 14th, which was close with an enemy fighter and stay with it until one of them was dead. Against those pilots, flying aircraft already optimized for close, slow-turning combat. The first American attempt to introduce the Corsair had produced exactly the result the geography and the enemy's experience suggested it would. What the geography also offered, if a pilot was willing to use it differently, was altitude. The slot ran north and south. Aircraft arriving from the south with altitude to spend could convert that altitude into diving speed on the approach to a target, reaching velocities that the lighter, less powerful aircraft rising to meet them from Rabaul's fields could not match. A pilot willing to commit to a single fast pass rather than a sustained turning fight could arrive above a Japanese formation, select a target, dive fire at closing speeds. No Zero pilot could easily compensate for and use the same momentum that carried him through the pass to climb back out of range before a pursuit could organize. The Zero was an extraordinary aircraft at low altitude and low speed. At high altitude, things were different. The same lightness that made it so agile in a close, slow fight became a limitation at the ceiling altitudes, where the big American engines were still producing near maximum power. The Zero's supercharger, like everything else in the aircraft's design, had been optimized for a specific performance envelope, and that envelope did not extend as high as the one the R2800 occupied. There was an altitude above which a Zero pilot chasing a Corsair was flying a slower airplane. Most Japanese fighter pilots in early 1943 did not yet know exactly where that altitude was. The American pilots were about to spend the next several months finding out that approach had a name by the time American pilots began teaching it to each other that spring. It was not an elegant name, and it described a style of fighting that felt to men trained on images of swirling individual combat almost cowardly. Boom and zoom come down from altitude with everything the engine could give you. Fire once. Leave. Don't stay to watch. Don't circle back for a second pass until you've climbed back above the fight. Don't give the Zero a slow target at low speed under any circumstances. It was the only way to fight in the slot and survive. It was also, if applied consistently by pilots disciplined enough to resist the instinct to turn back and finish what they had started, devastatingly effective. A Corsair diving from altitude onto a Japanese formation was doing something the Zero had no good answer to. It could not match the dive speed. It could not follow the climbing pullout without risking structural damage. And it could not protect every angle of a formation against fast slashing passes that arrived from above and disappeared before a pursuit could organize. While the pilots of VMF 124 were working through that lesson over the Solomons, in the early months of 1943, 3,000 miles to the northwest, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was looking at the situation from a very different angle. Yamamoto had planned the attack on Pearl Harbor. He had studied at Harvard and served as a naval attaché in Washington. He understood American industrial capacity in a way that few Japanese officers did, and that understanding had made him deeply skeptical of the wisdom of starting a war with the United States. He had spent the years before Pearl Harbor warning his own government that a conflict with America, whatever its opening chapters, would eventually produce an outcome that Japan's industrial base could not sustain. He had been overruled, the decision had been made, and once it was made, he had executed it with the expertise the position demanded. Now, in the spring of 1943, Guadalcanal had been lost. The position across the northern Solomons and New Guinea was under growing pressure, and Yamamoto saw in the pattern of recent engagements something that looked to him like an opportunity. American air activity had increased along multiple axes. Forward airfields were being pushed northward. The pressure on Rabaul was growing. If that pressure could be blunted, if a concentrated strike could inflict enough damage on American air assets to slow the momentum of the Allied advance, it might buy time for a more favorable defensive line to consolidate. He decided to strike back. He stripped the experienced air groups from two of Japan's most capable fleet carriers, the Shokaku and the Zuikaku, veterans of Pearl Harbor and the Coral Sea, and threw those pilots into a series of massed air attacks against Allied shipping and airfields across the Solomons and New Guinea. The operation was called Aigo. It opened on April 7th, 1943, when a large force of Japanese aircraft descended on Allied shipping around Guadalcanal with Zero fighters sweeping ahead of the bombers. The results were not what Yamamoto had promised. American fighters, including Corsairs, now flying with several months of hard-won combat experience behind them, rose to meet the attack. The vectoring that coast watchers and radar pickets provided gave American pilots warning that the pre-war Japanese tactical system had never had to account for, and the Corsairs that reached altitude before the Japanese formations arrived were using it the way Walsh and the other pilots who had survived the winter had been practicing from above, in slashing passes, turning back into the climb before the Japanese escorts could position for pursuit. Japan lost approximately 21 aircraft across the Operation Torpedo Bombers, their Zero escorts, none of it constituting the kind of decisive blow that would reverse the strategic picture. The damage inflicted on Allied shipping and airfields was modest. A destroyer lost, a tanker damaged, a few aircraft caught on the ground. Yamamoto never learned this. The pilots who returned from those missions filed combat reports, written in the kind of exaggerated language that exhausted men writing under pressure in the field have filed since the first organized air forces went to war. Ships sunk that were not sunk, aircraft destroyed that were damaged, fuel facilities burned that were merely scorched. The reports traveled up the chain of command and arrived on Yamamoto's desk in a form that bore almost no resemblance to what had actually happened over Guadalcanal and New Guinea that week. He called off the operation on April 16th, believing it had been a substantial success. 2 days later, on the morning of April 18th, Yamamoto boarded a Mitsubishi G4M bomber for an inspection tour of forward bases in the Northern Solomons. He wanted to visit the pilots who had just completed Aigo, to thank them personally, to maintain the morale of men who were, whatever the falsified reports said, fighting an increasingly difficult war against an opponent who kept getting harder to surprise. The itinerary had been communicated through naval communications channels that American codebreakers had been reading for months. The departure time, the route, the arrival schedule, all of it passed in Japanese naval code, and all of it intercepted, translated, and placed in front of the American commanders who had the assets to act on it. 16 Army Air Force P-38 Lightning fighters flew the longest intercept mission attempted to that point in the Pacific War and met Yamamoto's flight over Bougainville almost exactly on schedule. First Lieutenant Rex Barber put 50 caliber rounds into the lead bomber's engine and fuselage. The aircraft went down into the jungle canopy below, and the man who had designed Japan's air power at its apex, the architect of the attack on Pearl Harbor, was dead. Killed not by the strategic failure he had long feared, but by the specific failure of the communication security he had trusted completely. The man who had spent years warning Japan that it could not win a long war against American industry died because American signals intelligence had read his travel schedule and sent 16 airplanes to meet it. That irony was not lost on the officers who received the news from the Northern Solomons that afternoon. It should not be lost now. The same pattern, American information advantage, translating into operational surprise at the precise moment the Japanese side believed itself secure, would play out again and again in the months ahead, at scales far larger than a single bomber over Bougainville. The lesson that had nearly gotten the pilots of VMF 124 killed on February 14th took months to fully learn, and it was not learned in lecture halls or tactical briefings. It was learned in the air over the Solomons, paid for in aircraft and men, refined by trial and survival until it became doctrine, not because anyone decreed it, but because the pilots who survived long enough kept doing the same things, and the things they kept doing were working. The numbers behind the two aircraft explained why, once pilots stopped fighting against them. The Corsairs Pratt & Whitney R2000 800 engine produced roughly 2,000 horsepower. The Nakajima Sake engine, driving most Zero variants still in service, that spring produced roughly 1,000 horsepower at its most powerful wartime configurations, enough to give the Japanese fighter its remarkable lightness and its turning radius, not enough to match the big chance Vought aircraft in a sustained climb or a maximum speed dive. In a turning fight at low altitude, the Zero's advantages were real and decisive. Above 15,000 feet in a dive or in any engagement where raw speed determined who lived and who died, the numbers ran the other way and they ran hard. The Corsair's airframe could absorb punishment that would have torn a Zero apart. The Zero's weapons, a mix of light machine guns and modest cannon, optimized for the turning fight, the aircraft excels it through less concentrated weight of fire than the 650 caliber Brownings in the Corsair's wings. The Corsair's fuel tanks were wrapped in self-sealing rubber. The Zero's were not. A single 50 caliber round through an unprotected fuel tank could produce results that were immediate and catastrophic. The Corsair's pilots sat behind armor plate. The Zero's did not. Every weight-saving decision the Japanese engineers had made in pursuit of range and maneuverability was a survival decision that had gone the other way. None of it had mattered on February 14th because the pilots had tried to fight on the Zero's terms. It would all matter enormously for the next 11 months. The man who spent the most time working out what it would look like to fight on completely different terms was a career Marine from New York who had started his service as an enlisted aviation mechanic and worked his way into a cockpit the hard way. 3 years in the ranks before the war gave men like him the opening they had been waiting for. First Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh had been born on November 24th, 1916 in Brooklyn. His path to the cockpit had run through years of working on aircraft rather than flying them, maintaining engines, troubleshooting hydraulic systems, developing the mechanical intuition that comes from spending years inside the machines rather than merely sitting in them. When the pre-war Navy opened aviation training to qualified enlisted men, Walsh went through the program and came out the other side as a pilot who understood what his aircraft could physically withstand in a way that pure flying training could not entirely replicate. He knew what the engine sounded like when it was healthy and when it was not. He knew what the airframe could take, and he had a stubborn, specific refusal to accept that the only way to win a fight was the way the enemy had already mastered. What Walsh developed through the late winter and spring of 1943 was not a dramatic innovation. The basic concept, use altitude as stored energy, dive to convert it into speed, fire, climb, was not new to aerial combat. What was new was applying it consistently in the specific environment of the Solomons against an adversary who was expert at close-range turning, combat, and vulnerable to almost nothing else. The discipline required to resist the instinct to turn back and finish what you had started to fire, a burst, pull up, and climb away, even when it felt like the target was right. There was not a natural instinct. It was learned. Walsh learned it, and then taught it by doing it, mission after mission through the spring and early summer, in a theater where the teaching happened in the air over enemy territory, and the grade was pass or fail with nothing in between. By August of 1943, the Marine pilots who had survived long enough to absorb those lessons were flying a fundamentally different air campaign over the Solomons than the one that had opened in February. The exchange rates had shifted, not dramatically, not overnight, not in a way that was visible to anyone reading casualty reports from the outside, but in the air, in the specific geometry of engagement after engagement, the pattern had changed. On August 15th, Walsh led a division of Corsairs that ran into a Japanese formation, outnumbering his flight by roughly 6-1. Rather than break off, he dove repeatedly into the formation, using everything the previous months had taught him: altitude, speed, commitment to the attack, refusal to slow down and turn. His aircraft absorbed hit after hit from defensive fire and kept flying. He shot down 2 dive bombers and a Zero fighter before disengaging with a badly damaged plane that barely made it back to the strip. It was the kind of aggressive, almost reckless flying that gotten American pilots killed in less capable aircraft a year earlier. In a Corsair, flown the right way by a pilot who understood what it could take, it worked. 2 weeks later came the engagement that would define Kenneth Walsh for the rest of the war and beyond it. On August 30th, Walsh's engine began failing during an escort mission over the central Solomons. The failure was progressive, a loss of power that started small and grew, the specific kind of mechanical problem that forces a pilot to make a series of increasingly difficult decisions about whether he can complete the mission, reach the target, protect his flight, or whether the most useful thing he can do is put the aircraft down somewhere and try again. He put the stricken Corsair down at the forward airstrip the Marines had recently hacked out of the jungle at Munda on New Georgia, a strip that itself had been Japanese-held territory 4 months earlier, handed his damaged aircraft to the ground. Crew and climbed into a spare machine sitting on the ramp. He took off again to try to catch his flight somewhere over Kahili. He never found them. Somewhere over the target area, alone and separated from every other American aircraft in the sky, Walsh ran into a Japanese formation. Not a small patrol, not a flight of 4 on a routine intercept, approximately 50 Zero fighters flying in the organized, layered manner of men who had been doing this for years, a formation designed to provide mutual coverage, to catch a climbing attacker from above and an escaping diver from below, to make the kind of isolated slashing passes that Walsh had spent months practicing almost impossible to execute safely. A solo Corsair pilot running into that formation had 2 rational choices. He could turn back immediately using the aircraft's speed to put distance between himself and the fight before the Japanese could organize a pursuit, or he could call for support and orbit at a safe distance until help arrived. What Walsh did, instead, fell outside the category of rational choices defined by a straightforward assessment of the odds. He attacked. He dove into the formation the way he had been flying for months fast, committed, firing in a single burst and climbing back before the Zeros could turn and follow him, converting the altitude he had into speed, the speed into a firing path, the momentum of the pass into the climb that returned him to altitude for the next approach. One Japanese fighter went down, then another, then a third, then a fourth. 4 times he came through the formation, and 4 times he climbed back out before it could reorganize around him. The 5th pass ended differently. Cannon fire tore into his aircraft badly enough to force him out of the fight. With the engine gone, the cockpit damaged, and no power left to work with, he glided the Corsair down toward the water off the island of Vella La Vella and put it on the ocean's surface as gently as a dead airplane could be put anywhere. The aircraft sank. Walsh swam clear and inflated his life vest and lay in the open water, watching the empty sky where his squadron mates should have been, listening to the ocean around him, waiting for something to happen. Hours passed, the sun moved across the sky above him, the water was warm and the horizon was empty, and there was nothing to do but float. A boat finally spotted the small dark shape in the swells and came alongside. For his actions on both August 15th and August 30th, Kenneth Walsh became the first Marine to receive the Medal of Honor while flying the Corsair, the same airplane that had come home from its combat debut, having lost 9 Allied aircraft for a single Japanese fighter. His citation described what he had done in the flat, compressed language of official military documents, and that compression could not do justice to the specific quality of what the engagements had demonstrated. It was not heroism in the abstract sense that the word sometimes carries. It was the disciplined application of learned doctrine by a man who had figured something out and then proved repeatedly at serious personal cost that he had figured it right. By September of 1943, the Corsair's reputation among the Japanese pilots forced to fight, it had transformed into something close to the opposite of what it had been in February. A new squadron arrived in theater that month under a commanding officer whose reputation preceded him in ways that made some of his own superiors nervous. Major Gregory Boyington was 30 years old when he took command of Marine Fighting Squadron 214. He had been born on December 4th, 1912 in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, and his path to a Corsair cockpit over the South Pacific had been as idiosyncratic as any route the Marine Corps had produced. He had attended the University of Washington scholarship on a wrestling scholarship, earned his commission, and wound up in the pre-war Marine aviation program through a combination of talent, stubbornness, and a relationship with institutional authority that could be described charitably as complicated. Before the United States entered the war, Boyington had left the Marine Corps under circumstances that generated differing accounts depending on who was telling the story, and joined Claire Chennault's American Volunteer Group in China. The AVG, better known as the Flying Tigers, was the collection of American pilots who had gone to fight for the Chinese nationalist government before Pearl Harbor, and whatever its organizational eccentricities, it was one of the few places in 941 where an American pilot could accumulate real combat experience against Japanese aircraft. Boyington flew with the AVG until the group was absorbed into the regular Army Air Force structure, and then made his way back into the Marine Corps with 6 aerial kills on his record and a personal history that included the aerial kills, financial debts, at least 1 failed marriage, a troubled relationship with alcohol, and the specific kind of confidence that sometimes looks indistinguishable from arrogance until it proves itself in the air. He had been trying to get a combat command for months by the time VMF 214 became available. The squadron was not available because it was desirable. It had been built from a collection of replacement pilots who had arrived in the theater without a home unit, pulled from various sources, and handed to a commander who needed something to do. They were not the rejected pilots of popular mythology. Most of them were capable aviators who had simply ended up in an unusual administrative situations. But they were not the carefully assembled, thoroughly trained unit that any commanding officer might have hoped for. Boyington treated the situation as an opportunity rather than a liability. He told the men they were going to rebel. He told them they were going to do things up there that would make people pay attention. He did not, as a formal matter, tell them to be careful, because careful was not the word that best described the kind of flying Boyington had in mind. They called themselves the Black Sheep. The name was accurate in the narrow administrative sense of its origin, and Boyington weaponized it into something else, a statement of intent, a declaration that the unit's unconventional beginnings were not a deficit to be overcome, but a character to be expressed. A squadron that had not arrived through normal channels would not fight through normal channels. A typical fighter sweep toward Rabaul in the late autumn of 1943 began before dawn. Pilots pulling on flight gear damp from the previous day's tropical humidity, ground crews finishing their pre-flight checks by flashlight along runways that had been contested ground only months earlier. The Corsairs climbed in loose formation over open ocean for the better part of an hour, fuel gauges and cloud banks monitored in equal measure before the volcanic peaks of New Britain finally rose out of the morning haze ahead. Rabal's 5 airfields were visible as pale scars against the jungle below, ringed by the white puffs of anti-aircraft guns already beginning to reach for the formation's altitude. In the water below Rabal's harbour, the surface showed the pattern of a fleet anchorage, the long shapes of warships, the white trails of wakes from smaller craft, the grey geometries of facilities built to support operations at scale. From 3 miles up, flying fast enough to hear the airframe around you, it looked almost peaceful. It was not peaceful. Boyington was not a subtle man. On more than one fighter sweep toward the city, when the Black Sheep circled at altitude and Japanese fighters below seemed content to let the American aircraft burn fuel without offering battle, he broke radio silence and taunted the defenders by name, daring them to climb up and fight rather than wait on the ground for bombs that might or might not arrive. He challenged Japanese squadron commanders. Specifically, he invited personal combat in the language of a man who had decided that dignity in this particular situation was less useful than a Zero willing to pull up to altitude and fight. On at least one occasion, a Japanese-speaking voice broadcasting from Rabaul itself answered back, inviting the Americans to come down instead. A strange exchange, almost theatrical in its absurdity, playing out over open radio frequencies above an island packed with anti-aircraft guns and the last significant concentration of experienced Japanese naval aviators in the South Pacific. What Boyington understood and what his radio provocations were designed to accomplish was simple. A Zero on the ground was a Zero that couldn't be killed. The mission of a fighter sweep was to get Japanese fighters into the air where they could be destroyed. Making the enemy angry enough to rise and fight was, from a tactical standpoint, a form of mission success. He trusted the airplane and the pilots behind him. He trusted them enough to pick a fight at altitude over Rabaul by name over a live radio channel and mean it. Meanwhile, in decisions being made far from the cockpits and the radio provocations, the arithmetic of the air war was shifting in ways that would matter enormously the following summer. Japan's problem in late 1943 was a problem of irreplaceable loss. Every veteran pilot lost over the Solomons, every skilled flight leader who had trained for years and accumulated the specific expertise that years of high-intensity combat develops, was a subtraction that the Japanese training system could not make good in any relevant time frame. The pre-war philosophy had been to create a small number of extraordinarily skilled aviators. That philosophy had worked brilliantly when those aviators were unopposed. It was catastrophic when the conflict it produced started burning through them faster than they could be developed. America's problem in late 1943 was the opposite problem. The training pipelines that had been dramatically expanded after Pearl Harbor were producing pilots at a rate that would have seemed impossible 2 years earlier. Thousands of men were completing training programs and arriving in the Pacific with more flight hours than many of their Japanese counterparts, backed by an industrial capacity for aircraft production that was generating replacement machines faster than combat could destroy them. The gap between those two situations was widening every month. In early November of 1943, the Japanese commander at Rabaul, Admiral Minechi Koga, who had replaced Yamamoto after the P-38s took him down over Bougainville, faced a problem that the widening gap made acute. The sustained American pressure on Rabaul from carrier task groups and land-based squadrons was battering his air power faster than it could be reinforced from within the theater. He needed experienced pilots immediately. He made a decision that would cost Japan something it could not afford to lose. Koga ordered 2 of his most experienced carrier air groups, the veteran flyers trained to operate from the fleet carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku, men who had practiced together for years and whose accumulated skill represented the deepest reserve of carrier aviation expertise still available to the Imperial Navy, transferred off their ships and into Rabaul to reinforce the exhausted land-based squadrons. It was meant to be temporary, a brief reinforcement, a controlled commitment of specialist assets to stabilize a difficult situation, after which the carrier pilots would return to their ships with their skills and their experience intact. Within days, those carrier-trained pilots were being fed into the same grinding air battles that had already worn down Rabaul's original defenders. Fighting Corsairs over the same volcanic peaks in the same predictable corridors against pilots who had spent months learning exactly how to exploit the altitude and the speed advantage that the Pratt & Whitney gave them. The carrier pilots were skilled and they were experienced and they were flying the same Zero that had owned this theater a year before. None of it was enough. When the survivors were finally pulled back to the fleet anchorage at Truk that winter, Japan's 2 most powerful aircraft carriers were left with no trained air groups and no immediate way to replace the ones they had just spent over Rabaul. What Koga had committed as a temporary loan had become a permanent forfeiture. The bill for that decision would not come due until the following summer, but by December of 1943, it was already effectively unpayable. The mathematics behind Rabal's air battles were merciless. Every veteran Zero pilot lost over New Britain represented years of accumulated training that Japan's naval air service had no fast way to replace. Every Corsair pilot lost, by contrast, was backed by a training pipeline in the United States that had graduated more than 20,000 new naval aviators in 9,943 alone men who arrived in the Pacific with hundreds of hours already logged, ready to fill a cockpit within weeks of a squadron taking losses. Japan could lose experience and it could not grow it back in time. America was manufacturing experience at industrial scale. The two curves, Japan's declining pool of experienced aviators, America's expanding one, had crossed sometime in the middle of 1943, and by December, they were diverging rapidly in the direction that only one side in this particular competition could survive. None of this came free. In the 11 days between December 23rd and January 3rd, the Black Sheep lost 8 pilots over Rabal. 8 men who had climbed into Corsairs with the confidence that comes from months of learning to use a machine correctly, and had not come back. The names came in 1s and 2s, the way they always came: a missing aircraft at the end of a mission debrief, a name dropped from the duty roster, a bunk left unmade in a tent where the sound of the generators running had become the only reliable constant. The reversal taking shape in the skies over New Britain was not a one-sided destruction. It was a costly campaign fought against an enemy who, even in decline, remained capable of killing American pilots every time he put fighters in the air. The men living through that December had no triumphant clarity about what was happening. They had the exhaustion of flying multiple sweeps in a single week, and the specific dread of watching a squadron mate's name added to a list that grew steadily shorter as the weeks passed. The Corsair had stopped losing the war of numbers, it had not stopped losing pilots. And the men flying boom and zoom passes over Rabal that winter understood better than anyone back home how thin the margin between a kill and a funeral could be, even in an airplane that now held every technical advantage. The reversal was real, it was also expensive every single day. On January 3rd, 1944, Gregory Boyington led another fighter sweep toward Rabal. The Japanese, rather than avoiding the fight, sent roughly 70 fighters up to meet him. One of the largest interceptions the Black Sheep had yet encountered. The sweep became the kind of large, disorganized engagement that develops when two significant forces occupy the same airspace at the same time, and the geometry of pursuit and evasion fragments the original formations into small groups and individual combats spread across miles of sky. In the engagement that followed, Boyington shot down a Zero that burst into flame and fell away toward the water below. The kill tied him with the leading Marine ace of the war. At that point, a number that had accumulated one mission at a time over 4 months of fighting above the volcanic peaks of New Britain, built from every dawn departure and every fuel-critical return and every afternoon spent writing letters that had to be careful not to say anything that would get past the censors. Moments after that Zero went down, his own aircraft was hit. His wingman, Captain George Ashman, went down in the same fight. Ashman's had stayed with Boyington through some of the most aggressive flying in the Black Sheep's brief intense history, and his Corsair either went down over the water or over the island. Accounts differ in the details that only the pilots present could have known, and most of those pilots were occupied with their own survival, and he did not survive. Boyington parachuted out of his burning Corsair into the ocean below. He floated in his life vest in open water, watching the empty sky, listening to the silence, left behind after a battle moves on, and leaves one man behind in the water with nothing but the sound of his own breathing. The sea was warm. The sky was empty. The sound of aircraft engines had moved away and not returned. No rescue appeared. A Japanese submarine surfaced nearby. The men on the deck watched the American pilot floating in his life vest and pulled him aboard. He went below. The hatch closed. He spent the next 20 months as a prisoner of war, held in facilities whose conditions he would describe publicly only after his liberation in August of 1945, by which point most of the men who had served under him had long since accepted that he was dead. He was not dead, he was in Japan, living through circumstances that he would later discuss with the directness of a man for whom this experience had burned away whatever remained of his illusions about the world. He had watched the war continue without him from inside the walls of a prisoner of war facility, with no way to know what was happening in the skies over the Solomons, or whether the squadron he had built from replacement pilots and personal confidence had survived long enough to see what his tactics and their commitment had started. Boyington's capture closed something, not the campaign. The fighting over Rabaul and across the Solomons continued, but a particular chapter in the story Koptev of what the Corsair had become and what it had cost to get there. A single Marine squadron commander flying an airplane that Japanese pilots had dismissed as clumsy less than a year earlier had become valuable enough that his loss registered on both sides of the fighting. Discussed in briefings in Tokyo Felt in ready rooms across the Solomons. The terms of the air war had shifted so completely that a battle in which Japan managed to shoot down one of America's most aggressive and recognizable pilots still ended, on balance, as another entry in a long ledger of Japanese losses the Imperial Navy could not sustain. By early 1944, that reality had forced its way into official Japanese tactical doctrine, whether naval headquarters wanted to acknowledge it publicly or not. Standing orders circulated to remaining fighter units instructed pilots to avoid engaging Corsairs unless they held at least a 3-to-1 numerical advantage, and even then to make a single pass and disengage rather than commit to a prolonged fight. The nation that had spent 20 years building its air power around the premise that a single Zero pilot flying with proper spirit could take on an entire enemy formation and had proven that premise correct over Pearl Harbor and the Philippines and Ceylon was now printing the opposite instruction in official circulars and distributing it to its surviving aviators. In writing, run the distance between where Japan had been when VMF 124 first arrived over Bougainville and where it was when that circular went out could not be measured in miles or months alone. It could be measured in the specific quality of a conviction, the conviction that Japanese aviators possessed something the Americans could not match, that the Zero embodied an approach to aerial warfare that would remain decisive however many aircraft the American factories produced, that superior spirit and superior training would compensate for whatever advantage the enemy's industry eventually achieved. That conviction had been the foundation of Japanese air power doctrine since before the war. By early 1944, it had been dismantled one fighter sweep, a time paid for in the lives of the pilots who held it longest and in the institutional decisions, Yamamoto's commitment of carrier groups to Aigo, Koga's commitment of carrier air groups to Rabaul, made by commanders who believed the conviction was still viable when the evidence was already suggesting otherwise. The scale of what the abandonment of that conviction actually meant became unmistakable. On June 19, 1944, in the waters west of the Mariana Islands, Japan committed its rebuilt carrier air groups to the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the same fleet carriers that had been forced to lend their veteran pilots to Rabaul. The previous winter, now crewed largely by men who had received a fraction of the flight hours their predecessors had carried into battle. The pilots flying from the Japanese carrier decks that morning were not incompetent. They were not cowards. They had received the training available to them, and they went into combat prepared to do what that training had prepared them for, says. What they had not received, and what no shortened training program could provide, was the specific accumulated expertise that comes from years of high-intensity combat, flying, the pattern recognition, the reflexive response, the ability to process information faster than thought during a turning fight at altitude. American radar picked up the incoming Japanese formations more than 100 miles out, giving fighter pilots time to climb to altitude and arrange the kind of advantageous intercept that Corsair pilots had spent a year learning to create for themselves the hard way over the Solomons. The American fighters met the Japanese attack waves and tore through them so efficiently that pilots began calling out kills on radio channels crowded with traffic, and the phrase that attached itself to what happened that afternoon required no further explanation to anyone who flew in it, and said, Turkey shoot. Japan lost several hundred aircraft in a single day. American air losses were a fraction of that number. The carrier air groups that Koga had sacrificed at Rabaul to defend a fortress that fell anyway had left Japan without the trained pilots it would have needed most on the one afternoon that decided the war in the air over the Pacific. What remained of Japanese naval aviation after the Philippine Sea was not a force capable of contesting American air superiority through conventional combat. The arithmetic had run out. The reserves of experienced pilots that might have made the replacement generation viable in combat were gone, spent over the volcanic peaks of New Britain in an attempt to hold a base that was eventually bypassed anyway. The factories in Japan were producing aircraft. There were no factory lines for producing the pilots who could fly them into combat at the level the situation required. By the autumn of 1944, Japanese commanders had begun discussing openly what would have been unthinkable to the confident aviators of 1941. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, newly arrived to organize air operations in the Philippines, authorized the formation of dedicated special attack units. Pilots who would fly bomb-laden aircraft directly into American ships rather than attempting the increasingly hopeless task of releasing bombs and returning home through airspace now controlled by Hellcats and Corsairs. The tactical logic was cold and specific. A conventional bomb run required a skilled pilot who could maintain formation, find the target, release at the correct moment, and evade the defensive fire on the way out. A special attack required a pilot who could take off, navigate to the target, and maintain a heading. The second requirement was achievable in a compressed training timeline. The first was not. On October 25, 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Lieutenant Yukio Seki led the Shikishima unit, a small formation of bomb-laden Zeros, flown by pilots with orders that offered no possibility of return off a field in the Philippines, toward the American fleet gathered off Samar. One aircraft struck the escort carrier, Saint Lo, and punched through the flight deck into the hangar below, where stored fuel and ordnance ignited in a chain of secondary explosions that sank the ship within minutes and killed more than 100 of the roughly 900 sailors aboard. The men flying those aircraft were, in a very real sense, the final generation of a naval air force that had once been arguably the finest in the world. The air force that had struck Pearl Harbor with precision and coordination that stunned its targets. The force that had sunk the Prince of Wales and Repulse in the opening days of the Malayan campaign with a skill that overturned decades of conventional wisdom about what aircraft could do to capital ships at sea. The force whose Zero pilots had made the early months of 1943 over Guadalcanal look very different from the later months of 1943 over Rabaul. That air force was now producing pilots who had barely accumulated the hours needed to take off and maintain a heading. It was an admission made without ceremony in the language of operational orders that conventional aerial combat between Japanese and American pilots had already been decided, and decided badly enough that a one-way mission with a bomb was more likely to inflict damage than sending a fighter pilot up to fight and probably die regardless. The Air Force that had once trained its men for years before trusting them near a combat squadron had arrived at a doctrine that asked nothing of its aviators except that they fly in a straight line toward an enemy ship and never come home. When the long accounting was finally done after August of 1945, the numbers told the story in their own flat arithmetical way. Corsair pilots were credited with roughly 2,140 aerial victories against air-to-air losses of approximately 189 of their own aircraft. A kill ratio of better than 11 to 1, one of the most lopsided records achieved by any fighter type in the Second World War. The Corsair flew until the end of the war and beyond it, and the gap between what it had been on February 14th, 1943, and what it had become by August of 1945 was not a gap that any single innovation or any individual pilot or any tactical decision could fully account for. The airplane that its own navy had not trusted enough to land on its carriers, the fighter that had lost 9 aircraft for a single Zero, on the first morning it flew in combat. The machine that Japanese pilots had called clumsy and slow. When the first intelligence reports reached their ready rooms, that airplane ended the war as the aircraft Japan's remaining naval aviators' most dreaded meeting in the Pacific sky. It had not become that aircraft because anything in its design changed. The Corsair that flew combat air patrol over Okinawa in 1945 was mechanically similar to the one that limped back to Guadalcanal from Bougainville on the evening of February 14th, 1943. The same engine, the same bent wing, the same 6-gun. What changed was the pilots who flew it and the doctrine. Those pilots built out of defeat, one hard lesson at a time, from a Valentine's Day disaster to an afternoon above Vela La Vela, when a man fought 50 Zeros alone and came home floating in a life vest, from Borington's radio taunts over Rabaul to the long silence of 20 months in a Japanese prison camp while a country waited to hear whether he was dead. And behind those pilots, something that no amount of spirit or doctrine or individual skill could ultimately compensate for, the industrial capacity to produce another Corsair for every one Japan could take down, and another pilot for every pilot Japan could kill, and another trained replacement for every veteran lost until the numbers stopped being a contest and became simply a direction. Gregory Borington came home after the war and spent the rest of his life being the man who had commanded the Black Sheep. He received the Medal of Honor that had been awarded in his absence, presented by a government that had spent 20 months believing he was dead. He was not, in any conventional sense, a simple man, and the decades after the war were not uncomplicated ones. He was the kind of man who produces complicated decades and complicated histories, and the complications did not diminish what he had done in the air over Rabaul between September of 1943 and January of 1944. Kenneth Walsh came home and continued flying. The career that had started with years as an enlisted mechanic before he earned his wings extended through the conflict and past it, because the skills he had built were real and the institution that had built him valued what they represented. He lived a long time after the war. Long enough to see the aircraft he had mastered become history, and the tactics he had helped develop become textbook, and the enemy he had fought become a trading partner, and eventually an ally. The Japanese, who pilots first saw a Corsair climbing away from them over Bougainville on that February morning in 1943, could not have known that the clumsy bent-wing fighter disappearing into the clouds above them was not a failed design meeting its limit. It was a weapon that hadn't yet found the men who understood how to use it. Once it did, everything they had believed about the Pacific sky since Pearl Harbor had approximately 11 months left to live.